connected to iPhone.
The QuickBooks Self-Employed app allows me to take a photo of my receipts, categorize my expenses, and automatically track my mileage. It helps me organize pretty much everything.
The largest stone columns ever moved or erected are located at the Heliopolis in Baalbek, Lebanon. And this video is essentially a continuation of my last video, stating that the Romans did not have the physical or technological capabilities to move or lift these massive stone blocks that make up the foundation of the Heliopolis. Now, when you look at these columns, they are absolutely massive. 66 feet high, or 19 meters, 8.2 feet wide, or nearly 2.5 meters wide, and they're made up of solid rose granite or syenite, a little bit of both depending on which columns you actually look at this site. Just compare these columns to people so you can get an understanding of just how massive they truly are. But what's even more interesting is that they're nearly twice the size of Greek columns. Take, for example, the Parthenon, located at the Acropolis in Athens, Greece. These columns are 34 feet high, or 10.4 meters, and about 6.2 feet wide, or 1.9 meters. And they're made up of limestone. But the columns located in Baalbek, again made up of rose granite and syenite, were moved from 1,440 kilometers away, or just shy of 900 miles. And this is according to mainstream academics that credit the Aswan Quarry for being the location for where these stones were sourced from. Why on earth would they move something so massive? And if anyone could tell me the weight of these actual columns, because each column is made up of several different pieces. It might be 5, give or take. And again, remember, these are 66 feet high in total. So if you have more than 100 columns at this site, which I'll discuss in a second, you have a few hundred different pieces, which are, I don't know, someone leave a comment again if you can estimate the weight of these. I don't know, 10, 15 tons, maybe more a piece, and a few hundred of them moved nearly 1,000 miles. So again, why would they go to such an incredible extent to move these pieces from such a far distance to this site? Now, these columns made up the Temple of Bacchus and the Temple of Jupiter, but both of these temples are located on the Heliopolis, which in itself is something like 5 meters higher than the ground around it. But when you enter the Heliopolis, when you climb up into it, the Temple of Jupiter, for example, is 7 meters, or 23 feet higher than the actual foundation of the site itself. Now, speaking of the Temple of Bacchus, which is made up of 42 columns, 8 along each end, 15 along each side, and again, 66 feet high. And the Temple of Jupiter is made up of 54 columns, which only a few are still standing, by the way. They've come down from various earthquakes over the millennia. But you had 10 in front and back, and 19 along each side. And if you're interested in what's actually inside the Temple of Bacchus, since I'm mentioning it, you can take a look here as the other columns are inside. You can see there's some sort of altar. And if you look back at the doorway, look at just how high up that is, and especially when you compare it to other people. But if you take a closer look at the doorway itself, look at the shape of it. It's the shape of a trapezoid, which is very similar, and I've mentioned this in other videos, the similarities from different cultures across multiple continents, whether it's the pre-Incans in South America and Peru, or the Egyptians, that all utilize the same type of shape for doorways. Is that just a coincidence, or is it further evidence that ancient human civilization was once a global civilization, as I mentioned in many videos? So the question becomes, how did they lift these massive columns? Well, we know that they stacked the individual pieces of the columns on top of each other. But then when you look at the remaining standing columns at the Temple of Jupiter, the frieze blocks located at the top, the smallest of which weigh approximately 66 tons, and the corner piece has been estimated between 108 and 110 tons, and was somehow lifted more than 19 meters, or nearly 63 feet, off the ground. Now, mainstream academics give sole credit to this entire site to the Romans. Now, in my prior video, I discussed the capabilities and limitations of the strongest Roman crane in existence, which had a maximum lift of approximately 6.6 US tons. And mainstream academics will tell you that because the Roman cranes could not possibly lift anything this high, 63 feet off the ground, they must have created some sort of unknown support structure in order to elevate the cranes. So wait a second. Essentially, they would need to have 17 of these Roman cranes surrounding one of these columns in order to lift that block to the top. Like, that's just not feasible. And speaking of not feasible, let me mention a few things that I...
Well, it really doesn't matter if you have a digital image and you just send me a digital copy in an email or a text message, and I print it out myself. I normally print them out as an 8x10 or 5x7. I mean, or 8x10 or 5x8. But yeah, it doesn't. On your end, the picture doesn't have to be any particular size. If you can just text it to me or email it to me or send it to me in a message on Facebook or Instagram or some shit, and I'll print it out to whatever size I want it to be. And how much would I charge for a portrait this size? Whoa. It all depends on, once again, how many people are in that portrait. This canvas is a 36 by 48 inch canvas, so just alone for this project, just for me to start one, just if you're going to say, alright, I want that size canvas, my starting price is going to be like $700 just for this canvas, and then we can look at the picture and see how much more we're going to go from there. So you're going to give me, hold up, let me make sure my prices is right. I don't want to tell you the wrong price for my starting point. Is it 7? I meant to take a nap today, but I didn't. Oh, that's $800 to start. A canvas this size is $8. So my standard 18 by 24 is $400 to start. And each size that you go up is an extra $100 just for me to start the project. So if you want a 22 by 28, that's a $500. 24 by 36, 30 by 40, or 36 by 48. So for something this size, you're already looking at like in a ballpark of like $1,200, $1,300.
I should have mentioned for my prior video involving moving the massive 900-ton trilithon stones. Many comments I received on that video were from people discussing the video of a gentleman named Wally from Michigan where he himself lifts or erects a 20-ton stone all by himself through simply moving dirt, moving weight, and utilizing pressurized water through a hose in order to displace the weight and it will erect itself. It's absolutely brilliant, by the way. But there are a few things wrong with this brilliant theory on why it would not work over here at the Heliopolis with the trilithon stones. I mean, imagine just, first of all, there's no space to work with. I mean, this is, when you see the demonstration, they do it on the ground. But over at the Heliopolis, they're building a wall. So did they just keep moving dirt up? And another question becomes, what did they use for pressurized water? I mean, surely they didn't have electric motors or gas engines to pump water, did they? But the very nature of the method itself, there's a big difference between moving one block on top of the other and erecting a stone. You really just need to watch that video for yourself so you can see, one, that it's brilliant, but two, that it just wouldn't work based on the very nature and the structure of the Heliopolis itself. It just doesn't make sense. Now, some of the other comments I got were people suggesting that, wait a second, they would have used ramps and probably elephants too in order to pull these massive 900-ton stones up and put them in place. But wait a second here. First, imagine on how big this ramp would have to be. For it to be an incline that's at least shallow enough for anyone to pull something, that's over 2 million pounds up it, it would have to have a very low grade. So in other words, this thing would have to extend out, I don't even know how many hundreds of feet. But furthermore, are we supposed to believe that for each stone going from left to right, they would have had to move this entire ramp over again? And not to mention, did they have some sort of steamroller? Because imagine on how tight you would have to pack in that dirt in order to support the weight of something that weighs a couple million pounds going up it. Otherwise, the dirt would just displace it. So we're supposed to believe that they just did it back and forth for each stone? I mean, even take a look at inside the Heliopolis. The massive 800 and even 900-ton stone blocks that are inside of it, which I already mentioned are more than 5 meters off the ground. So are we supposed to believe that they moved tens of thousands, presumably, cubic meters of dirt in and out of the Heliopolis to do those stones too? Just moving them back and forth? And again, going to the elephant argument, I almost forgot to mention. How many elephants would you need to pull a 900-ton stone? Well, I did some research, and apparently one male elephant can pull somewhere between 9 and 10 tons. So if we're talking about a 900-ton stone, guys, that's about 90 elephants, 90. And that's assuming that they didn't need more than that, since if you're going up an incline, you would need more elephants to support that additional weight. But just think about the distance from the front elephant to the stone. I mean, we're talking about presumably a couple hundred feet, because how many elephants can you fit in a row? So how far could they possibly get one of these stones up to the Trilithon wall? Do you see what I'm saying? It doesn't make sense. The elephants are going to fall off.
But that's the whole thing. Nobody can figure out these ancient structures, these ancient buildings. How did they do that?
This digital literature rack combines our best-selling magazine scan with impactful
inserts that would fit into that, and then pull these on the cage, and then they would, once it was all set up, they would pull on these ropes and they would lift this 1,000-ton block up and move it a few inches and then start again. So this is their explanation for how people are doing this. But you have to think, why would you even want to build out of such giant blocks of stone and do something which seems to...
I didn't mean to do that.
Long gone.
Yeah, how they were able to do all of that shit before. I mean, even with our modern tech, you can't really still do a lot of that shit they did.
side roads.
They say that the Sphinx might have been carved smaller, you know, out of something that was once bigger than the Sphinx was. But the specific thing he was talking about was the columns, and they are segmented, so you can tell that, you know, they were stacked on top of each other. But it's like, how? And the fucking Greeks didn't have the technology to do that shit. These columns are 66 feet tall. Like, how the fuck did they do that? 66 feet tall and like fucking 6 or 7 feet wide.
Every day. Interestingly, this is also about how far it is to low orbit.
I think I listened to this episode.
If we ever want to have a truly serious presence in space, we are going to need a lot of infrastructure in orbit. Today, we are going to try painting a picture of what that would be like and review some of the challenges we have to overcome to achieve it.
Okay, I did listen to that one.
Instead of patenting the technology and sitting back on a sunny beach collecting their Nobel Prize, I've always wondered why supervillains with weather machines try to go for world domination instead of patenting the technology and sitting back on a sunny beach collecting their Nobel Prize and billions of dollars in profit.
Yeah, like HARP technology. So I haven't listened to this episode.
The topic for today is weather control and geoengineering. Essentially a second look at terraforming, but with our planet specifically in mind. How do we warm things up or cool things down? How do we make a place like the Sahara Desert a cool forest, or the Antarctic a warm jungle? How do we build islands or make inland seas drinkable? How would we build cities on the bottom of the ocean, or underground, or inside a mountain? We aren't too interested in the near-term stuff. That's not what this channel tends to be about. We also aren't going to be discussing the ethics of any of these projects or climate change. Any tinkering with the planet at this kind of scale has ethical issues that won't be black and white. It's not a lifeless rock we're terraforming. It is our own planet with its own existing ecology. As to climate change, everybody has their view on that already, and I have no interest spending my limited time discussing it when so many others have. It's totally irrelevant for our discussions today anyway, because we'll be dealing with technologies and projects that could handle the worst-case scenarios of runaway greenhouse effects with a casual shrug. It's certainly an important topic, but if you're doing the stuff we'll be talking about today, it has ceased to be one. We are not controlling the weather by seeding the clouds today. We're doing it by building giant mirrors and shades in orbit, or erecting artificial mountains as windbreaks. These are the kind of all-in strategies where we are talking about turning millions of workers and trillions of dollars worth of equipment and industry on a problem. And we don't actually care today if the ocean level will rise in the future or why, just what we can do if it does. And again, this episode isn't about the ethics of any of this. Obviously, deciding to make Greenland a nice summer resort has lots of consequences and ethical dilemmas. We do not care about what those are today, though they are good and worthwhile topics for contemplation. But at the end of the day, I don't have any special insights on them, and others can discuss them as well or better than I can. What I can discuss is how to make it a warm sunny day on the northern Siberian coast in the middle of December. We are going to do a little bit of history on these topics, and I should add that while it isn't necessary to have seen them before, there is material we have covered in previous episodes which I'll be skimming over here. The impact of fusion power, some of the simpler megastructures like orbital rings and launch loops, arcologies and nucleomonopolises, and the original terraforming video, and even our look at oceanic planets in the Habitable Planet series gives some of today's topics a deeper look, and viewing them afterwards might fill in some gaps. As to history, folks have wanted to change the weather and landscape for all of recorded history, and doubtless long before that. They have frequently been partially successful too, at least for the landscaping. The weather not so much. Even today, a lot of the technologies used for weather control, like cloud seeding, are viewed as dubiously effective at best. But when it comes to messing around with the ground, we had projects going on in antiquity that make even the pyramids, or the Great Wall of China, look like modest endeavors. We have seen artificial island construction all the way back to antiquity, and just about everywhere. From far west with the Aztecs of modern Mexico to far east in Micronesia, and further north in Nagasaki, and pretty much everywhere in between. The Scottish and Irish Crannogs were artificial islands. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs built artificial islands, or maybe more peninsulas, called chinapas, into their lake to grow more food. Canals to move water for irrigation date back at least 6,000 years ago to Mesopotamia, and quickly made their way to the other floodplain civilizations in India, Egypt, and China. Those folks also built huge levees to control flooding, and eventually we saw dikes reclaiming chunks of land from the sea in places like the Netherlands. And in places with lots of steep hills like the Philippines and Peru, we saw terracing to open up new and fertile land. This was all long before we had anything like the tools we have now, often before we even had metal tools. Nowadays we have dynamite and bulldozers and huge trains and freighters to move the earth. With the advent of those things in the 19th and 20th centuries, people began getting a bit more ambitious. And with the invention of the airplane, we saw some of the first attempts at weather control, which didn't involve asking for supernatural intervention. Much of human history was one with a constant anxiety about water, not having enough so that your crops wilt, or having too much and watching your home and livelihood destroyed by storms and floods. Water was life and death to them, and it permeated every aspect of their culture. Now what causes rain? Clouds, of course, and these are made of tiny droplets of water and ice, very tiny. Now while water melts at normal pressure at 0 Celsius or 32 Fahrenheit, it doesn't actually freeze at that temperature. It can, and will in your freezer at home, but it can remain a liquid to about -40, either scale, they cross there. Water in between those temperatures is called supercooled water, and it will turn to ice at a temperature depending on the type of nuclei present. Water requires some non-gaseous surface to turn from a vapor into a liquid. When we are talking about tiny bits of dust or other contaminants floating around in the air, we call those a nuclei, or a cloud condensation nuclei more formally. The size of that nuclei, that mode of dust or whatever, as well as the temperature and pressure, all control the formation of droplets of water and ice to form clouds. This is just condensation, no different from when water in the air condenses on a cold glass of lemonade. But keep in mind, these droplets are not universally the same size. In order to get rain, you need to make those droplets heavy enough to precipitate, which means heavy enough to fall down under gravity. Now any drop of water left to itself ought to fall down. It's denser than air, same as rock or a person is. But in this case, more like a feather or snippet of paper. There's a rising force of air keeping them up, and the bigger the droplet, the more force is needed to keep it from falling down. Warm air with water in it rises up from the surface and cools, both forming the cloud and keeping it afloat. And the cloud keeps getting bigger and bigger and keeps forming bigger and bigger droplets until those begin to hit the critical point where they fall down and you get rain. If the wind picks up, you get turbulence and drops collide and form bigger drops and you get rain. There's a lot more to this, but we'll stop there. This is not an episode on meteorology, which is good because I'm not an expert on that field. Most of what I know is from when I worked for the Air Force as a teenager and shared an apartment off base in Dayton with a mathematician and a meteorologist, and we chat fields over beer and cards or kicking a soccer ball around. I was a civilian, incidentally. My roommates weren't, junior officer and a cadet. I later joined the Army after grad school, but this was back when I was 19 and a senior in college. Meteorology is a subfield of physics, and I've picked up more here and there, but it's not something I'd ever presume to claim expertise in. But here we see the key elements: temperature, amount of water vapor, the size of contaminants serving as nuclei, and wind. Cloud seeding revolves around introducing contaminants to work as nuclei. Just after World War II, Bernard Vonnegut discovered that silver iodide crystals were very good as these nuclei, and cloud seeding was born. You fly up into a cloud, spray silver iodide, and the rain falls. Cloud seeding has a dubious reputation, which it deserves. What I just described absolutely works, but keep in mind, a cloud is not a small thing. Your average cloud has about a gram of water per cubic meter, which is about a millionth of the density of water in a bucket at 1 ton or 1,000 kilograms per cubic meter. But they are huge. We usually measure rain in inches and centimeters, and you want something of about 100 cubic meters of water per acre or hectare to qualify as a decent amount of rain for crops. A hectare is about 2.5 times the size of an acre, so an inch of water on an acre is just a centimeter on a hectare. I'm speaking in broad generalities and trying to hit both metric and US standard systems for my mixed audience. Point being, though, if you want to water a town's parched farmland, you need to be delivering millions of cubic meters of water, or millions of tons of water. Anyway, even if 1 molecule of silver iodide caused 1,000 molecules of rain to fall, you'd need about 1,000 tons of silver to get the job done, which isn't much shy of $1 million worth of silver you will never see again, and certainly more than you can squeeze into a small airplane of the kind used for this purpose, which might hold, say, 10 tons tops. So the notion is that it is acting as a catalyst that is causing orders of magnitude more water to fall than you dumped into the clouds. This is what makes it controversial, because even today, we can't determine how effective it is. Some regard it as a complete scam, others as a very effective process. The science remains a bit iffy. It works, but not much, and not worth the cost is the usual notion. For watering crops, anyway. China used it in 2008 with the intent of making clouds rain before getting to the Olympic stadiums, and that's a bit of a different matter in terms of cost and practicality. The Olympics is a big deal, both during and long after. Tons of money. So if an option offers even a 1% chance of making it not rain on the events when it would have, even several $1 million on that throw of the dice is worth it. There's a character in one of Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide novels who is a rain god, and also a truck driver, and everywhere he goes it rains. He eventually proves this, and folks say forget about getting paid to visit places that need rain. Think of how much money he could make by agreeing not to visit tourist locations that rely on sunny weather. Now we have some alternative substances like dry ice that can be used, frozen solid carbon dioxide, and sulfate aerosols, which derive in part from phytoplankton in the ocean, our first example of biological rather than physical or chemical weather control. Key thing is about quantity and timing. We can expect to get way better about telling when, where, and how much as our knowledge of meteorology and computers improves. But on this channel, where the idea of flat-out building planets often gets discussed, the notion of sucking 1 million tons of carbon dioxide out of the air and condensing it into dry ice, then dropping it into the clouds, is an option on the table. So is leveling a mountain range that prevents a place from getting rain, or erecting one to act as a massive storm barrier. The weather, of course, doesn't just get affected by the temperature of the planet. It also affects that temperature. When it's cloudier, less light gets in, less water evaporates to make more clouds. The ultimate power supply of the Earth is the sun. It accounts for all but a tiny fraction produced from either fission reactions in the planet's center, extraterrestrial sources like other stars, or light reflecting from the moon or entering from tidal forces, or from direct human generation. All those things have a serious impact on the planet, but in terms of raw energy, they all sum up to considerably less than the variance in light we get from the sun. The Earth orbits the sun elliptically, and gets about 7% more light when it is closest to the sun than when it is furthest. That's not the cause of the seasons, by the way. The Earth is closest to the Sun and hottest in January. But that 7% is a big deal and much more significant than the roughly 0.1% variance of the Sun's 11-year cycle, which is itself bigger than most of the other effects I mentioned a moment ago. But while the Sun is the principal heat pump, it has little to do with the weather beyond that. It's simply a power pump that varies in strength in the course of a year by 7%, about 0.1% in an 11-year cycle, and a bit less on another cycle we still haven't fully determined that's believed to last 200 to 300 years. Other cycles of the Sun, as well as the galaxy, have been proposed, but these remain hypothetical due to the very long timelines we'd need to absorb them, and the uncertainty values of things like ice cores that let us peek into ancient weather. Sunlight needs to hit the ground to feed our plants, but to get there it has to go through all the air and clouds that are more reflective or higher up bounce it away into space. Similarly, a massive tract of white, reflective sand bounces much of it away, while much can be absorbed in the air itself. Something's reflectivity in this context is called its albedo. Most of the Sun's light is also infrared, an essentially useless frequency of light for the purpose of seeing or powering plants. It's also how energy, once absorbed, gets re-emitted to radiate away into space and cool us. I should note that infrared is a huge chunk of the light spectrum, and what comes from the Sun is very nearly visible, while what we and other warm objects like trees or the ground or even ice emit is much further away from the visible, and the materials which are said to absorb or reflect infrared light do not necessarily perform the same for both these segments of that spectrum. We consider a greenhouse gas to be a gas which absorbs infrared light. Oxygen, nitrogen, and argon, the three main constituents of our atmosphere, do not absorb it. Water vapor, methane, carbon dioxide, and so forth all. In and of themselves, that creates an insulating effect to warm a planet, and everyone agrees on that. The argument is about feedback effects, positive and negative. Warmer planet, add more water vapor, temperature rises more, a positive feedback. But you also get clouds, more light gets reflected away, cooling a planet, a negative feedback. No one disagrees about that either, by which I mean no scientists. No one else's opinion matters in this regard. There's tons of disagreement about the various feedbacks and their total effects. The loose consensus is the net feedback is positive, but it is very hard to determine the specifics. Needless to say, we really want to know those specifics, and in the next few decades we probably will get them down, or at least get them down much better. This matters a lot for the more subtle types of geoengineering because it tends to rely on trying for a tiny change that acts as a catalyst, the same way the silver iodide is thought to for cloud seeding. Complex dynamic systems, like our planet, can show huge unexpected changes from minor effects, or be surprisingly resilient to them. Most of our interest isn't on the subtle at all. There's nothing subtle about dumping millions of megatons of water on a desert every year to try to make it green. That will produce way more water vapor in the atmosphere, and when it does turn green, it will absorb more sunlight than the sand does, both of which would warm the planet, though amusingly, it would also suck carbon out of the air to feed those plants. Obviously, it sure would be nice to know how much that was impacting temperature. Similarly, making jungles down in Antarctica or sunny beaches along Siberia's coast or the Hudson Bay would have a pretty big impact, one of which would presumably be changing sea levels, but that by itself is not too big a concern, relatively speaking. Contrary to what some movies indicate, even if every drop of ice was melted at both caps, there'd be tons of land left over, almost all of it. But more importantly, one can build dikes on a coastline, which sounds like a huge task, and it is. But places that have hundreds or thousands of kilometers of shoreline usually have millions of kilometers of roads, and that's a fairly similar thing. Coastline length is tricky to measure since they generally are not straight lines, making them longer, but that's good because it gives you more shoreline real estate. If you were diking up your coastline, you'd probably want to make it quite wavy, more coastal properties. That's an important point when building artificial islands too. A great big circle is your most landmass efficient method, but not particularly ideal for either homes or agriculture. Long, snaky islands are better. Landscaping your coast to maximize their size is one thing you might do, but it's also a good idea to scape them in a way to minimize runoff. The fresh water and the nutrients in it when a river empties into a sea is quite valuable. How much are we talking about, by the way? If we decided to dike up all the planet's coastline, Scale always matters, so it's worth asking. There's no agreed-on figure for the length of the Earth's coast, but most place it at somewhere around 1/3 kilometers. The absolute maximum sea rise, if we melted all the ice everywhere, is about 80 meters. So let's go quite over the top and assume our dike needs to be 100 meters high and 30 meters wide. That would be about 1 trillion cubic meters of rock, or about 1,000 cubic kilometers. That's around one large mountain, and a decent fraction of Mount Everest. Of course, slicing up and transporting a mountain isn't a cheap thing either, not that we'd use just one for the whole planet. Personally, I'd terrace my way up mountains and use the spill for dike filler, 2 birds with 1 stone. This must sound insanely expensive, and it would be, especially considering we just designed a dike that was absurd overkill. You'd build something like this in stages, but we'd be talking about a few trillion tons of rock, some of which would need to be traveling across oceans to low-lying islands, costing somewhere around $10 a ton. So you could be talking about spending something like the entire US or EU GDP for a year, maybe more. Though again, our dike was the overkill version, and you would have many decades to build something like that. You could end up using more mass to make some nice new coastland, which always has a higher property value. Ideally, such projects should be done at a profit, but more to the point, you'd probably want the maintenance of the dike to be paid for by the property taxes on coastal properties, so maximizing them might be beneficial. Annual sea level rise is usually put at a bit under 3 millimeters, or about 1/8 of an inch, so at that specific rate, you'd want to add a couple inches or 50 or so millimeters to your dike height every dozen or so years when you were doing maintenance on a chunk, to stay ahead of it and correct a bit of sinking and compacting. Obviously, you need to speed that up if you do something to increase the sea level, like, say, dumping an entire mountain into the ocean to make an artificial island, displacing that water, or melting the ice caps to colonize those areas. Our oceans have a surface area of about 360 million square kilometers, so just dumping a cubic kilometer of rock into the ocean somewhere would make them rise by about 3 micrometers. Dump 1,000 cubic kilometers of rock in and the sea rises 3 millimeters. It's not a zero-sum game, but no matter what you do when you screw with the planet, there will be changes elsewhere. The art is probably in minimizing those, at least the undesirable ones, and the key is being able to accurately predict them, which we can't do just yet, except in the most general and uncertain ways. So how would you make land in the Arctic warm? The obvious way is to add heat, but the question is how? We also want to get the most bang for our buck. For instance, if I want to add a nice tourist beach in northern Siberia, I also want to add in some fishing and farming nearby. We also want to pick carefully how we are adding heat. Just adding sunlight, pure sunlight, means we also get all that infrared light, which is useless for seeing by or making plants. In the grand game, heat is the enemy, and every drop of it you make should be the result of a useful and productive process. Even if you like it warm, it is far better that the temperature occur as a result of things which benefit us, not simply being added in. If you heat your home electrically, you don't turn off your TV and lights to save power, because so long as your curtains are closed, every drop of that turns into heat when it is done entertaining or illuminating you, while your heaters are just doing that and nothing else. This matters a lot in any post-fossil fuel economy, with the exception of one where we are still doing heating with something like firewood or some other biomass. If you are on solar or fusion for a power source, you are using electricity to power your heaters, so you might as well use it first to run lighting or computing or whatever, as it is now free. So now let us talk about solar mirrors and shades. The concept is simple. You put a mirror in orbit around the Earth to bounce more light onto a spot, or you put a shade up to reduce the light. The shade may also be placed at Earth's L1 Lagrange point. I also want to emphasize that you never want to think of these as singular objects or massive. A square kilometer of shade made of something a micrometer thick is just 1 cubic meter, generally a few tons. The whole cross-section of our planet would take a couple 100 million times that much material to shade in its entirety. But for a conceptual equivalent, that's around the mass of the colony ship Unity that we discussed last month, or several large pyramids. It's a lot, but nothing like the mass we discussed for our planet-wide seawall. You would be talking about many thousands of conventional rocket launches, though. Of course, you don't need to shade the entire planet, nor do you need to source the material from Earth. The Moon or a near-Earth asteroid would work. They are also, again, not a single object, not some massive shade hundreds or thousands of kilometers across, but tons of tiny ones massing about as much as a person and covering a football field or so. So we don't ever want to beam infrared light down to Earth. It's useless. So our shades are opaque to infrared light, but not to visible light, not opaque to both. Better to have two shades blocking infrared than one blocking infrared and visible. Same heat blocked, but no useful light lost. Same for the mirrors. You make them reflect visible light, but not infrared light. You might also want to block some ultraviolet light too, but that does have some uses. You can also be selective, blocking just part of one of those frequencies, like blocking some of the green light that plants don't use, but not all. For current climatological concerns, we need to block at most 1% of the sun's light. Incidentally, you'd never be able to tell we were doing this unless you were looking right at the sun, and it would be hard to tell even then, especially if we decide to block 2% of the infrared rather than 1% of all light. Of course, you'd not be able to tell looking at the sun anyway, since you'd rapidly go blind and hardly see clearly while you did this. And you wouldn't put up one big shade or a bunch of small ones all together. You'd spread them out more evenly. This is probably your fastest climate change fix. Get a big factory base on the moon and churn out thousands of tons of shades. Pack them into pods and launch them with a mass driver to unfold when they get into their position. Each one will occasionally need to be replaced. Maybe every decade, maybe every century. But you'd be maintaining a few million square kilometers of shade. And depending on their lifetime, that means you'd be manufacturing between 100,000 to 1 million tons of shade every year. Sounds like a lot, but that's less throughput than a large car factory, and you are manufacturing something a lot simpler than a car. I'm also using very approximate numbers. An aluminum solar cell is about 1/10 of a micrometer thick, but I don't think you'd want to go that thin. We don't actually care about the mass that much. It's just that a lot of times when I discuss these concepts, folks figure I'm proposing some Herculean task we could never do. Obviously, setting up a moon base stacked with thousands of workers and robots, mining and manufacturing shades and mirrors, is not cheap. Neither is employing 1 million people to excavate rocks and transport them hundreds of kilometers to make and maintain seawalls. It might be cheaper to just stop screwing with our environment, but it is the reason I don't worry too much about some things. Global warming, solar shades and dikes and seawalls. Extinct species, get samples of their DNA, freeze them and transcribe them digitally, and clone them back when it's safe to have them again. These are not great solutions. Much better not to make something go extinct in the first place, but it removes some of the stress when you know it can be fixed. So what about Arctic and Antarctic colonization? What about weather control with solar mirrors and shades? The former is simple enough, conceptually. You just aim a mirror or dish or lens, or of course many of them, at the spot you want warm. Keeping that on target is a bit trickier, but not only do we have tricks for that like Mornia or Tundra orbits, but you wouldn't need to. Again, you're not using just one, and they're on all the time, whereas I don't want to light a spot all the time. I could use a series of mirrors in one orbit to light 3 spots around the planet, like someplace in Canada, eastern Siberia, and Sweden, and just swivel each between the targets. Sometimes they're almost all on one point, for it's noon. Sometimes it's half on one and half on another for later in the day. This lets you circumvent the times of year when those places would be completely dark, too. By the way, since some of you will be wondering, no, these are not good weapons. Anything making power in large quantities can be weaponized, but it is sort of like stealing thousands of flashlights so you can aim them all at once at one person and burn them to death. It's a lot easier to just steal a gun and shoot them. You could focus a bunch of them on one spot, but you'd be building them to focus individually on large spots in the first place. So like the flashlight, you'd have to turn tons of them on one place to light it way brighter than noontime sunlight, which you might do for weather control. Needless to say, being able to add and subtract sunlight where you want it with shades and mirrors is a pretty effective weather control system. Problem is that we don't have the calculation power yet to really do that with precision. Hypothetically, you can focus mirrors on a place and heat it up, evaporating water or warming up a cold front. But when it comes to stuff like hurricanes, you don't want to brute force it. These are definitely the right tool for weather control, but they need to be accompanied by tons of supercomputers, figuring out the minimum energy to apply at just the right places. We will get there, probably before we even have solar mirrors or shades. But in the meantime, your best protection in terms of geoengineering to protect yourself from things like tidal waves is seawalls. specifically seawalls, not the dikes we mentioned earlier. Probably artificial reefs placed just over the horizon from the coast, so they don't interfere with your view. Good for fishing and marine agriculture too. Of course, people could live there too. I mean, we can make both ships and buildings that can handle hurricanes, especially with some newer materials and techniques. Personally, I like the biological approach to this stuff. You don't just make a wall, you make a reef or a farm. More food for people and the fish too. As we discussed in the Ocean Planets episode, the deep sea doesn't have a lot of life in it because while there's plenty of sunlight, the nutrients are all deep down where the light doesn't reach. The other problem about such planets, where there is just no land, is that nothing breaks up the storms. So there is a lot to be said about us deciding to build tons and tons of thin islands, which supply those nutrients and break up those storms. You could just knock over lots of mountains for such purposes, making those places nice to live while adding islands with the removed mass. But we should keep in mind that the same type of supermaterials we contemplate for things like space elevators make great skinny anchor tethers or support pillows for floating islands, or ones that just sit on some thin pillows and widen out near the surface. As a similar concept, you can hollow out mountains using the same types of materials if you want to keep them as storm barriers and for their aesthetic look. You'd have to bounce light inside them though, but you could probably make a glass-top dome that an orbital meal could send extra light through that would look like a snowy cat from a distance. You could do similar tricks if you wanted to make warm oases in Arctic areas. If you're thinking about thawing out tundras for living area, but want to keep a lot for natural habitats, you can increase the food supply in those natural habitats with oases like that. It lets you keep your tundra, desert, and ice sheet habitats in smaller quantities, but housing more of the natural life. Polar bears need a couple hundred square kilometers of sea ice habitat each for their food supply, but if you're enhancing the local biomass with the occasional warmer, fertile oasis, you get higher polar bear density. Essentially just a big greenhouse with a lot of entrances designed to minimize heat leakage, with light shining down on it. Easier to use fusion, of course, which also opens underwater habitats like the kind we discussed in the Ocean Planets episode. Fusion, if you can make it work and make it cheap, is way better than orbital meals for getting these jobs done. It lets you put grow lamps down at the bottom of the deep sea to do the oasis trick again, and lets you use those tether anchors if you're doing the floating islands, as the vertical reefs I've discussed in other episodes. Those tethers don't have to run exactly vertically either. You can run a few out at angles to anchor something more like guy wires. You stick some grow lamps on those and some places for dirt and nutrient to collect, and you've got another new food supply for people and fish. Doubling up too, because that ought to increase the marine snow that feeds all the critters that live in the black deeps of the bathypelagic and abyssopelagic zones. You would still want the shades though. Prevents overheating when you're basically producing Kardashev 1 scales of energy. The shades are always handy. You might even intentionally cool your planet more with those shades than you normally should, just to ramp up the amount of carbon dioxide and water vapor you can have. Plants love both of those. So if you can increase them, while keeping the photosynthetically useful wavelengths of light the same, and the temperatures the same, you'd have quite the biomass explosion. We do not necessarily want to remove the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, not if we can keep the temperature the same, although we do not necessarily want to do that either. One can make the argument that what maximizes biomass, both the total present and the production rate, is the best option. You also do not have to put shades up in space. Balloons tethered to the ground can be floated up to affect light away, just like orbital shades. If these are infrared reflective on their tops, so much the better. Probably not a bad power generation method either. Probably cheaper than the orbital variety if you have to build on Earth too. Balloons need to be sturdier, thicker, and more expensive to manufacture, but you save on the launch costs. If you're building up in space, probably the other way around. We also have some biological options too, especially if we open the door to genetic engineering, though a lot of existing species will do the job with judicious usage, helping to control runoff and erosion. We discussed some of the more far-out options for that in the gene tailoring and bioforming episode, and we're running long on this episode, so I'll refer you there. But imagine for the moment being able to grow your seawalls or islands by using plants to do carbon capture, and use that to make the structures in question. But even if you're building them out of concrete and steel, you can still drop some dirt and plants over top of them. It's sort of like in the Arcologies and Euclinopolis episodes, which this episode is pretty tied to. How we saw that a planet-wide city wasn't some smog-filled hellhole covered in concrete and steel, packed with 1 trillion people, but rather a lot of forests not very packed with people at all, even though we'd probably have a couple trillion of them, because it basically comes down to getting rid of heat and making the most use out of your energy before it turns into heat. Same thing today. We were just looking more at the planet than the places we live on it. Obviously, a lot of these techniques discussed today won't be practical for some time, maybe never. They all have consequences too. That's what happens when you're terraforming your own planet. The ethical issues for each I leave for you to consider, and you're welcome to talk about them in the comments section below, or over on the Facebook group, Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur. Next week, we'll be looking at crazy aliens, and unlike in the Stupid Aliens episode, we won't be discussing misconceptions about aliens from fiction, but rather how many of the things we think of as crazy might be normal to actual aliens, or how they might view us as nuts, and each other too. To get alerts when that and other episodes come out, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to like it and share it with others. Until next time, thanks for watching, and have a great week.
Yo, Jason, what up?
influential men got influential friends, and I'ma put the squeeze on all of them. I watched y'all get fat, now I'm on my share. Once you ain't got it all, then I'm almost there. The most influential men got influential friends, and I'ma put the squeeze on all of them.
I like that people count on me, but sometimes I need help. I want a health insurer that makes managing employee benefits easy, so I have more time for other important things.
Like skipping these fucking commercials.
It's that heat, boy.
Yo, why don't you just fucking stick? Why won't you just fucking stick to the damn shit?
Somebody's going down.
Ringo, rated R.
Oh, just got paint on this shirt. Yeah, we're getting like 5 to 8 inches of snow up here too.
That really excited me about God was to begin to realize that he is sovereign, and that he is auspicious, that he is in control, and that he has absolute power. It was interesting to me to find out that he foreknew me, that he knew me before I was born.
I just like the smell. I just like the smell. just like the souffles.
You know what life is? Life is what you make of it.
Life is full of commercials.
Quiz Cube for that video.
just me and my paint. Yeah, it's just me and my paint and I paint. I'm sitting in the room when I'm lonely, and I'm just painting on stony. Yeah, it's just me and my paint. Just me and my paint. It's just me and my paint. Ooh, me and my paint and I'm sitting in the room all lonely. Yeah, me in the room all stony. Just me and my paints. Just me and my. Just me and my paint. Yeah. Well, the dark green in the back is kind of wet. It is really wet. I just put it up there. So I really shouldn't even be doing it, but I'm just trying to play around with a little bit of wet on wet right now. You get a different effect with the wet on wet paint, but you can like make it muddy and fuck it up. So where it gets real dark into the dark blues, I'm not gonna really try to touch that yet. I do want that to dry a little bit.
Cody.
Do you suffer from a lack of True TV awareness?
All of March is True TV Awareness Month.
With new episodes of our best original comedies.
I'm aware. Well, I'm like...
I can be me. I can be whoever because I'm true to me. I can go to neutral things because I can look direct. That because he don't got don't mean he was bad, or don't mean he's a criminal, or don't mean he's crazy, or
stand up to work on this shit, man. This canvas too fucking tall. I could set it on the floor, actually. Let me see if that'll work.
QuickBooks Self-Employed goes everywhere you do. You can track your mileage automatically. Just categorize your trip with a swipe. Be ready for tax time by effortlessly tracking your expenses year-round. With automatic categorization, you can see
fucking commercial.
Jones.
break the back of the energy crisis. We will lay the foundation for our future capacity to meet America's energy needs from America's own resources. 1974 must be the year in which we organize a full-scale effort to provide for our energy needs, not only in this decade, but through the 21st century. At the end of this decade, in the year 1980, the United States will not be dependent on any other country for the energy we need to provide our jobs, to heat our homes, and to keep our transportation moving. The world price of petroleum has quadrupled in the last year. I'm recommending a plan to make us invulnerable to cutoffs of foreign oil. It will require sacrifices, but and this is most important, it will work. Bluntly, I must remind you that we have not made satisfactory progress toward achieving energy independence. Energy is absolutely vital to the defense of our country, to the strength of our economy, and to the quality of our lives. Such vulnerability at present or in the future is intolerable and must be ended. Our excessive dependence on foreign oil is a clear and present danger to our nation's security.
And here we have a serious problem. America is addicted to oil, which is often imported from unstable parts of the world.
For more than 30 years, we've been hearing that this is a problem. Why hasn't something been done? America is more dependent now than ever on foreign suppliers of energy. Is there any solution to this problem? If there is, why hasn't the problem been solved?
I mean, given all the technology we have in this world, it's remarkable that we haven't had an alternative to the combustion engine or an adaptation to the combustion engine that makes the petroleum last longer. And many have long thought that oil companies have bought up patents to allow them to continue to make more money. No one's proven it.
If technology exists to improve gas mileage, why hasn't someone seen it?
The man came to the airfield one day with a 1946 Buick Roadmaster. He had invented a carburetor that was water injected and could get close to 100 miles per gallon. He told us that Shell Oil Company had bought the patent from him, which made him a millionaire. Shell told him he could keep the one on this Buick, but could build no more. Now, the Buick Roadmaster was a very heavy car. Can you imagine what that would save on the lightweight cars of today and our energy consumption? Also, the oil industries would have gone broke. My question, whatever happened to this invention? It's been over 55 years, and I'm sure if it was put on the market with today's technology, it could be even more improved. Sincerely, K.R. Cundy, senior citizen.
There has long been a legend of a water-injected carburetor that enabled amazing gas mileage. Did this man see it?
Well, when he drove out that day, we were racing our cars, and we didn't think much of him. We saw this Buick. It was fairly new. I thought maybe he was going to race us too. But he just sat there and he talked to us, pretty soon. He mentioned, he said, I can make this car get close to 100 miles a gallon, and we thought he was just blowing steam, And he raised the hood and we looked at it. I don't know, it just looked like a bunch of crap on there, But anyway, we looked at it and didn't think much of it because it was just a gadget as far as we were concerned, so we didn't think too much more about it. Had to have been 48 or 49. Yeah, those old Buicks, it had 4 holes on the fenders. And that's how you could tell whether it was a 3-holer was a special, and 4-holer was a Roadmaster. And they were big. He mentioned that he had built 3 or 4 of them. He put them on a couple of other cars. We were sitting there talking about it. He said that Shell told him he couldn't build anymore. And he says, they bought my patent and made me a millionaire.
Proving that gets to be a little more of an issue.
Yeah, we looked at it because it was different, you know, something new. And how it worked, I couldn't tell you. Because it was really just a gimmick to us. You know, we didn't think anything would come of it.
Buick Roadmaster, curb weight, 4,465 pounds. Hummer H3, curb weight, 4,700 pounds. The Roadmaster weighs almost as much as a Hummer. What if a Hummer could get 100 miles to the gallon? Did Shell Oil really bury this technology?
They've done a pretty good job covering it up. People who've looked haven't been able to find those patents on the record.
In 1946, a man living within 20 miles of Modesto, California, where Ken Cundy raced cars, registered this patent.
This particular device is a very simple concept that takes water and humidifies it and allows that humidified air to be drawn into a carburation system, such as an internal combustion engine in an automobile. Conceptually, I can see it does a few things. When you add humidity to the air, it allows the thermal properties of the air to cool the engine and make a more even combustion process, which prevents pre-ignition, and that's one of the claims in the patent. So,
it may readily be seen that with a device of this kind, higher compression ratios can be utilized, materializing more power and fuel economy, and also permitting the use of lower-grade fuels.
That alone is a big improvement in the efficiency of an engine. We all have had the knock in our automobiles before, and so this reduces that. It can also increase power, I believe, by allowing you to use a lower octane gas or just increase your torque. Either one is possible. So I see fuel economy opportunities with this.
Why don't we know about this technology?
Why? That's the question I'm asking. And why I wrote the letter. What happened to that?
Who would you call if you had this idea?
Would you call Shell scientists? What if they had a laboratory less than 10 miles from your house?
Here at the Agricultural Laboratory near Modesto, California. It's a modern laboratory, complete to the last detail.
The old Shell building still exists today. The inventor's son was originally excited to participate in this film, but will no longer return our phone calls.
I believe that maybe Shell wants to sell gas.
Representatives from Shell Oil declined to speak to us.
If I was running an oil company, I would want to make you desire my product as much as possible. And since we're running out of the resource globally, the price for them can only go up. So they're trying to squeeze blood from the stone. They're realizing that they're in the most profitable portion of their business right now. Of course they're doing that. That makes sense.
In 1977, the book Fuel Economy of the Gasoline Engine, which was published by the Shell Oil Company, documents that Shell scientists were able to achieve 149.95 miles per gallon on a 1947 Studebaker. This book is out of print and has disappeared from the Library of Congress. Here are the pages. The Shell Oil Company would not talk to the filmmakers, but in February of 2007, they were able to interview a retired Shell scientist living in England.
My name is David Blackmore, and I worked for quite some years in Shell Research. I edited the book called Fuel Economy of the Gasoline Engine. And we normally would test our fuels in real or sometimes prototype vehicles and engines that we would have contact with the motor industry, the motor manufacturers. It began in one form or another 60 years ago, just before World War II, 1939.
A race to see how much gasoline we need to run our car 1/4 of a mile.
Doing the first vehicle just before the war, I think that particular one was in fact a converted vehicle from a road vehicle at the time, and I think that first one was something like 49, 50 miles per US gallon. When the specials began, it was they managed to get into the hundreds of miles per gallon, but there was still some quite excitement in a few years before the 1,000 mile per gallon barrier was broken, which I think didn't happen until the late 1970s.
What have we been doing while scientists have been getting 1,000 miles per gallon?
The technology's there. It's just no one wants to pay attention to it.
Well, the technology is there, and we could use it in the marketplace. There's no will to do so.
Did this man witness an invention that could have changed history?
Wish we had it today.
So I remember reading that and going, God, I could do this. This would be easy. I could do that on my old Mustang. The idea is great. I really enjoy reading things like that. People who aren't afraid to say, hey, why are we doing this?
It's not unakin to what the oil companies and the motor companies did in Los Angeles when they used their money and their political connections to tear up mass transit lines in order to make way for more automobiles so they could sell more cars, more gasoline.
That is done often. In fact, most patents never get used, either because they're maybe not that great of an idea, or somebody squelches it, such as you might be suggesting here.
As opposed to a local ripoff of Los Angeles, for which there was actually convictions. This is a worldwide ripoff. This is a worldwide crime. It's a crime that is potentially responsible for the polar ice caps melting, for the Icelandic coast falling off, for the warmer weather we're going to have continually, according to scientists, because of the pollution. If we use less petroleum, a lot less petroleum, because it was better technology, our planet would be there longer.
I would bet that the gas prices back in those days were around 5 cents per gallon, and the goal was to sell as many gallons as possible. So if the Shell Group had their capitalistic hat on, they want to sell as much of it as they possibly can. And maybe nothing else mattered. I don't know their corporate ethics. And maybe it's just pure greed.
If this device had been used instead of shelved, what would the world be like today?
Yes, that can't be possible, but it is possible. My name is Ernie Pierce, and for a living I work for Continental Airlines. Started out as a mechanic and worked my way up to where I was a technical supervisor. Along came this article in the paper about a gentleman named Tom Ogle down in El Paso, Texas, and he had invented a car that would get 100 miles to the gallon, and so I was really interested in this idea. So I read this article and it showed a picture of his car, and the more I read, the more interested I got in what he was doing. So I had an old 72 Pinto sitting in the backyard, and I said, I'm going to try this thing. So I took this 72 Pinto and got myself a propane tank for my little project. So I took the propane tank and took it to a guy and had a chamber put on the bottom, like Tom did with his. One thing you have to understand, the only thing that makes a cylinder pop is vapor. When you run a carburetor, the only thing that makes a cylinder pop is vapor. When you run fuel injection, the only thing that makes that engine run is vapor. It's whatever vaporizes in that cylinder under pressure that burns. Raw gasoline will not burn. If you flood a car, you can't get it started. It's got all the gasoline in the world in it. So if you only put vapor in the cylinder, you're going to get 100% burn. It's not anything like the car that I worked on, but I can give you an example of what I would do if I wanted to run this car in vapor. I'd take the suction line and I'd hook it up to a tank here so it was pulling a vacuum into this suction line. It would run through the air conditioning carburetor here and run it through a vapor carburetor. So I'd run on vapor. If I ran out of gas vapor, I'd flip a switch and I'd run on gasoline. So that's a secret. Now that's basically what Tom did. He was running strictly on vapor that comes off of gasoline. That's why he got 100 miles to the gallon. I didn't get 100 miles to the gallon with my system because it wasn't as good as it could be. But if you took it to a dealer or a major company, they could improve upon the idea then, and we'd have something fantastic today.
What happened to Ernie's invention?
When I was working on this project, I went to Las Vegas and was sitting in a parking lot out there, and out of the clear blue sky, he hollers at me, "Did you ever hear the story about Tom Ogle?" And I said, "Well, what about him?" And he said, "Well, you know, he's the guy that invented the vapor car." I said, "Okay." He said, "They found him in the desert dead from an overdose of drugs." I said, "Is that right?" He said, "Well, you don't think for a minute that they let one man change the way they do business with gasoline, do you?" It just dawned on me, why would that guy holler at me? I never prompted anything about anything but this. Now, isn't that amazing? I was ready to run this car on Riverside Raceway. I had the manager of Riverside Raceway ready to set that up with the press and everything. And this man told me, he says, "I'll give you 6 months and you're a dead man." But when you find out that Tom's not here anymore and they found him out in the desert dead, that's where they found him. That opens your eyes a little bit. We'd gone back home and I continued working on the car. But about 2 weeks after that, my wife
old fake ass paint. Every time I come in here, he's already done.
I have no idea. They
Dude
just
don't even be
made
painting.
themselves very visible. We knew after a while, after about 2 weeks, they were watching us, and we knew why. You know, there's two guys sitting across the street with a video camera. You know who they are. Why else would they be sitting there? You know, it's pretty obvious. That was enough. I just let it go. I didn't want my wife to get hurt. I didn't want to get hurt, so I just took all the parts off the car, put the car up for sale, and sold the car. Ford Motor Company, if you want to work on this system with me, all you got to do is give me a call. So
it seems like somebody would be able to break through, that the oil companies can't kill off every single person who comes up with those ideas.
What actually happened to Tom Ogle and his invention?
I suppose there's probably not a month goes by what I think about it. Maybe sometimes just days to think about it. Tom Ogle and his invention. What could have happened? Especially when I'm watching the nightly business report and see that crude oil prices is up to $90. Maybe going to be $100. Well, Tom was, he seemed like a likable sort of fella. He was friendly and everything. I think he, like a lot of teenagers, you know, he liked to have his good fun and stuff, you know.
Tom Ogle worked for Wiley's friend Jim Peck in his auto shop. It was during this time when he told Jim about his idea for the vapor engine.
So I would go out to the shop different times and talk to him, things like that. But he didn't have too much time for a lot of foolishness. He was working on that car. Here's a picture here of Tom, and Jim told him just go ahead and work on it. Don't bother about anything else. So the car belonged to Jim Peck, and so Jim bought all the parts, anything he needed, and go on there. So that tank was pressurized to such a point and also heated. You had a certain amount of heat and the pressure. And the two together caused nothing but vapor to go in for the burning. And so that's what you got 100 miles per gallon by that. On the day of the trial, to run this thing out to see what the actual mileage would be, Jim Peck gave me a call and said, Wiley, come on out to the shop and bring your car, and we're going to Denton, New Mexico, on a test run. Before we left, we drained all the gasoline out of this car, went across the street with a little can, got 2 gallons of gasoline, and brought back and poured it in there. And did this right inside the shop. One of Jim Peck's drivers drove my car, and we followed Tom Ogle in this car. That thing would run too. That thing would. We had to kind of step on the gasoline to keep up with it. So we went to Deming, which was 100 miles from El Paso, and we made an exit there over to Holiday Inn. Stopped and went in. We all sat around a little round table there and had a cup of coffee. And while we were there, well, several people came in for our autographs and so forth. And then after we left there, we came back to got as far as El Paso, and it ran out of gasoline right just about the center of the city. So we checked it out, and it still came to just a fraction over 200 miles that we had made with 2 gallons of gasoline.
After that fateful trip to New Mexico, Tom became a local celebrity. Not only does Ogle's car promise more miles per gallon, but he says it will clean the environment. I've had the oil companies try to buy my unit with the agreement that I'd never build another. I refused to sell, and the only thing they had left was to try and break me in court.
So it makes you kind of wonder how they got to him and got that thing, if he felt that way. But
eventually, Tom found a company in Washington that he felt would take his invention to market.
They claimed that they were going to take it up to their place, and they had the technicians and everything that was going to refine that thing, up to a better point than what it was.
His was sophisticated enough to get him dead.
After his Oglemobile was taken away, Tom was found dead in his car. According to an investigator, his death was due to alcohol and an apparent overdose of the drug Darvon.
I've often wondered about that. They found him out, found him dead.
It was often speculated that Tom's death was due to suicide.
Quite a few that I've talked to said that they really didn't think it was suicide. Somebody got to him, but nobody really knows.
After Tom's death, the company that took the car stated the engine did not work. After that, the Oglemobile disappeared. Tom's widow, Monica, said she was too frightened to discuss his story with us.
These things that you witness like that, it sure makes you wonder why something hadn't been done before this time. And it's not a hoax, because there's too many people there that witnessed it, and we have no idea where the old Ford is now. Makes you wonder why somebody, like you said, with all that technology now, why they haven't come up with something that would get us better gas mileage. And nothing has been done on getting us any automobiles or anything else that'll get that kind of gas mileage.
They would not let you do it. And I don't know that they would today.
If this is all true, why would oil companies keep resisting better technology?
Corporations, of course, are not set up to be good citizens. They're set up to be money-making machines, and they happen to have the most profitable money-making machine in the world.
Well, there's this operant paradigm that gets, really lodged in people's brains called greed. And when you look at the profits of the oil companies today, it's a no-brainer why this is still going on. And yet, why people aren't standing up to resist it is a question that I certainly don't have an answer for.
In just 25 years, global energy demand is expected to increase nearly 50%, with oil and natural gas needed to meet the majority of that demand.
The amount of petroleum products that are consumed is so enormous, it's hard to even comprehend.
At current market prices, the bill for the world's petroleum consumption is more than $2.5 trillion a year. That's greater than the U.S. government's entire annual budget.
Smell the coffee.
Are the oil companies really sticking to our gasoline?
Just a yes or no answer.
Well, Senator, there are no easy yes or no answers in this business.
It's just a simple question.
No, it's much more complex than that.
He's right. After this disaster, gas prices rise above $3 a gallon for the first time in U.S. history.
Our people have a growing suspicion that the oil companies are taking unfair advantage of the current market conditions to line their coffers with excess profits.
Oil's a very interesting market. It is probably the market which is most impacted by political turmoil. It is very heavily impacted by weather, especially when you talk of things like Rita and Katrina, because we produce a lot of oil in the Gulf of Mexico, and Texas has major refineries, and Louisiana has major refineries, and when those hurricanes moved in, I mean, it took a lot of our refining capacity offline. It shut down a lot of the production wells. Supply decreases dramatically, and as a result, prices go up.
So you had, in that case, what we were calling, in technical terms, the double whammy effect, in which you were seeing higher prices due to higher crude oil prices, but also due to the gasoline market.
You know, I'd come home on the weekend, and it had gone up another 25, 50, 65 cents a gallon.
There was a lot of complaint that prices went up excessively after the hurricanes. As you stated, that Exxon had record profits over that time period.
The more crude they own and the less they have to buy, that does generate some very serious profit.
Before Katrina, every time we raised the problem with the gasoline prices, the oil industry always said, oh, it's the world price of crude oil. We got to pay $70, $80 a gallon. It intuitively made sense, even though they weren't paying those prices. They had their own crude oil operations.
I can see how people might look at that and be suspicious.
The news media is fabulous for the oil industry. They might as well buy the news stations and run them.
Presented as a public service by Standard Oil Company.
Any kind of crisis that comes up, I mean, Middle East, to hurricane, to any natural disaster, they use all of that information, I feel.
For as much concern as there was about the rising gas prices, did the gas prices reach a point where millions and millions of people decided to get a new vehicle, or decided to cut out the family vacation, or everyone decided to carpool? No, it didn't reach that. It wasn't large enough for people on a real broad scale to change the kinds of cars that they drive or the kinds of fuel that they're going to seek out.
You know, I think the real wake-up call could be, you know, global warming and the Katrina, things like that. But I think it's going to take a tidal wave coming over LA or something for people to be like, oh, maybe there's a correlation there.
After Katrina, the oil companies had to scramble for a lot better explanations.
In the fall of 2005, the major oil companies all report record-breaking profits. Congressional leaders, feeling pressure from Americans, call the oil executives to explain themselves.
Could we have quiet, please? I shall not administer an oath today.
Mr. Chairman, I would like the committee to vote on whether we swear.
There will be no vote. It's not in order at all. It's the decision of the chairman, and I have made that decision.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we swear in the witnesses.
I rule that out of order.
I second the motion.
That's the last we're going to hear about that because it's out of order.
Congressional hearings are part of the essential work that the Congress does. You build a record in a hearing by asking questions of the witnesses, the professionals that come in, the people that are part of the issue, whatever the issue is.
And I think Americans are concerned. In the midst of suffering, in the midst of sacrifice, record-breaking profits.
These oil executives were not sworn in. How can we get answers if they don't have to tell the truth?
Corporations are supposed to make a profit. That's what they do. They do it incredibly well, some of them. But there has to be the counterbalance, the social counterbalance, which is what our leaders are supposed to do. Our public representatives are supposed to represent the public.
Congressional hearings are very, very important, and they are supposed to instruct our work. My sense that day is that it was more PR than anything else.
Here, obviously, this is the most important hearing to the pocketbooks of the American people.
I think that it was meant to give the American people the impression that we were going to do something, thinking very hard about doing something about the increasing cost of gas at the pump.
In the aftermath of September the 11th, the price jumped about 40 cents a gallon, and you all stepped in, froze the prices, and assured the distribution, and things settled down.
Does that mean oil companies can control the prices at the pump?
In the aftermath of Katrina, likewise,
the price rose about 40 cents almost overnight. And so why would there not be the similar response?
In our own case, in the directly affected areas, we froze the price. Outside those areas, what we tried to do is maintain continuity of supply and at the same time avoid a shortage.
We get no crude from the Gulf, and yet the prices in the West Coast spiked as well.
I think most consumers find it terribly unfair, and you know, talk is cheap. They're saying to Congress, we want some action.
As the response to Hurricanes Katrina and Rita have proved, markets work, even under the most extraordinary circumstances.
You know, Katrina actually proved to us exactly how the market doesn't, because you have an example where there's a hurricane, oil production stops, and the price climbs up to $5 a gallon some places. Okay, that's because it's scarce, but that gasoline wasn't made after Katrina hit. It didn't cost that much to make the gasoline. It was made before Katrina at the $2 a gallon price. So I think the public had an awakening. What you're paying for gasoline isn't what it costs to make it.
Are you telling the committee today that had we not had the hurricanes, that your profits would be even higher?
It doesn't make any sense to believe anybody who's producing oil about anything that they have to say, because it is in their best interest to lie. And I don't blame them for lying. They just want their money. That's why they're lying. But to base your public policy on a bunch of known liars seems like idiocy.
Oil companies have raised gasoline far in excess of the jumps in crude oil prices. Even if you take for granted that they actually paid the world price for crude oil, which they don't. Oil companies' prices still went up, for instance, from January to April of 2006 by about 60 cents, and the price of crude oil only went up 12 cents a gallon.
That's 48 cents above the cost of crude oil.
So even if you believe what they say, they're still gouging.
But if you have a good hearing, what you learn in a hearing can change your views about some things because you have professionals testifying. That's not what that day was about.
History teaches us that punitive measures hastily crafted in reaction to short-term market fluctuations will likely have unintended negative consequences, including creating disincentives for investment in domestic projects.
Does this sound like a threat to send their record profits out of the country?
We haven't had a new refinery in the United States of America built in the last 30 years. Not one. Demand for gasoline has gone up 30%. These refineries have become more efficient, so capacity supply has only gone up 10%. That is a recipe for huge prices and big profits. And we have some memos from oil companies from the mid-90s where they articulated exactly this issue.
If the U.S. petroleum industry doesn't reduce its refining capacity, it will never see any substantial increase in refining margins.
They said, we have too much refining capacity and we've got to cut it back if we want to make big profits. It's on paper. And yet, oil companies insist they do nothing wrong.
Oil companies try to limit refinery capacity?
Because there's huge amounts of that going on.
We had a big run-in with Shell up in Bakersfield.
Your company, Shell, announced it was closing its oil refinery in Bakersfield, California, an oil refinery that supplied 2% of our state's gas. We already had some of the highest gas prices in the country, and the community was up in arms.
And very quickly it became apparent that Shell was lying.
This was a struggle to get Shell to cooperate with us. The Attorney General had to force them, in essence, to open up their books.
We got some documents showing this was actually the most profitable refinery in Shell's entire system in the world.
Internal documents showed Bakersfield Refinery was making the biggest marginal profit of any Shell refinery in the country. So could you please explain why your company put out that word, that there were no buyers? That wasn't true. That the refinery wasn't reliable? That wasn't true. That the refinery wasn't making money? That wasn't true. Was it because you wanted to control the supply of gasoline?
They wanted to shut it down because if they can make less gasoline, they can make more money.
It seemed to us, and in retrospect still does, that there was a desire to short the market even more.
If you don't have the capacity that you say you should have, then the costs are greater because it's going to take longer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It all kind of leads to one place, and that is
record-breaking profits. The way oil companies make big money is by artificially reducing supply so that the market's running almost on empty with just a week or two of inventories. And then when there's a crisis to the system, the market sends the price of gasoline through the roof because it's a commodities market. There's a sense that there's a shortage. So oil companies can then charge $3.50 for gasoline. It costs them $1 something to make. And that's how they record the biggest profits in the history of the world, quarter after quarter recently.
Unsatisfied, Congress had an additional hearing on May 11, 2006 to investigate the capacity of U.S. refineries.
In just 25 years, global energy demand is expected to increase nearly 50%.
Can you explain then why ExxonMobil has said it doesn't plan to build any new refineries in the United States? Are they looking for new ways to invest their record profits? Are you aware of the comments of ExxonMobil?
I am aware of those comments, yes.
And do you want to comment on those comments? I mean, they run contrary to what the committee is basing many of its, or at least some of its decisions on. I see that the distinguished chairman of the full committee is laughing, except it was our staff here at the committee.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be glad to.
I'm not laughing at you. I'm just saying
how
unfair it is of you to quote their own words. It's a low blow to use what ExxonMobil has actually said against them. I mean, that's kind of a cheap shot, don't you think?
Well, I think that's what my constituents would want me to do. It's their quote.
So I guess it was a tough question, but I thought that it was an incriminating statement that they had made.
And we weren't laughing at you, we were laughing with you. We were thinking about the lady came over.
This is strictly business, Mr. Chairman, and I understand that.
I know that. Ed probably didn't really want to answer that question. I wouldn't have if I'd have been him. But you asked good questions. We admire you. We weren't laughing at you.
No. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, what that said to me was that I'd made a good point.
How can Americans put faith in investigative hearings when the two chairmen have taken more than $1.5 million from the oil and gas industries?
We need to be more angry as a citizenship because we're being failed by the people that we put in power. And the arrogance of most of the people in power, and that's Democrat and Republican, that they somehow deserve or have the right to be, is obnoxious. They work for us. And when they do something that is so obviously against our best interest, we should fire them. We should vote them out.
When Representative Barton's press secretary was asked for a comment to explain why,
it's a low blow to use what ExxonMobil has actually said against them.
The response was, that seems to be the norm on our committee. Ask anybody.
Texans on the committee fight very, very hard to protect the oil industry, the refineries, and that, so much of which is based in Texas.
It's like a judge who takes money from the plaintiffs and the defendants, and whoever gives more is the one who gets the verdict their way.
Congress, for one thing, is a reactive institution. I thought when I first was elected that it was proactive and that, we'd think things through and we'd read wonderful books and have authors discussing the theme of their well-written theses, and that out of that we would debate that, and then we'd have great legislation. I don't know what got into me.
Of course, the oil companies have spent literally tens of millions of dollars in campaign contributions to stop all real reform.
As long as I am chairman, regulating global warming pollution is off the table indefinitely. I don't want there to be any uncertainty about that.
Everybody in the Congress has money flowing in from a variety of interests, and you can always point to the conflicts of interest.
I think it's larger than Chairman Martin and larger than Congressman Hall.
And I might ask Shell if you're interested in shale oil in Wyoming as well as Colorado.
Absolutely, Senator.
I know that.
People really believe, for the most part, that we're all bought and paid for.
Since 1990, the oil and gas industry has contributed more than $49 million to the Democrats, more than $150 million to the Republicans. Since George W. Bush was elected, the oil and gas industry has contributed more than $19 million to the Democrats, more than $82 million to the Republicans.
Unfortunately, these powerful, rich, greedy people can sequester a tremendous amount of political influence with the dollars that they're taking out of the pockets of every working person in this country, and they're funneling those profits to completely contradict the correct interests of those people.
I got the money to do it, they do it, and it's the worst type of political corruption.
These are huge sums of money, and of course they come into play. Of course they do. I mean, you'd have to be totally naive to say that it doesn't have some kind of effect.
In January 2001, when President Bush took office, the average price of gasoline was $1.47. In May 2007, the average price of gasoline was $3.12. It went from $1.47 to $3.12 in less than 2 terms.
Battery low, please charge now.
Close to the oil industry. It's too close to the oil interest. I mean, we have 2 people as president and vice president who really came from the oil industry. And so, in a sense, they're way too close to the oil industry to give it the kind of scrutiny that it needs.
Even if you're not getting money from big oil, if you go after big oil, they're going to spend against you, a big independent expenditure, and you're going to lose. So everybody's scared of big oil. The people who are taking the money are the friends, and the people who aren't taking as much money are still worried that big oil is going to spend against them.
Big business was in control. It ran the government.
What I always say to constituent companies that are in my district, always know that I will work with you because you employ my constituents, but know that I don't work for you. I'm not on your payroll.
How did things get to be like this? Has it always been this way? Let's look at the history of oil.
Cheap oil prices have been a big part of growing civilization over the last 150, 200 years.
How did it start? Let's ask the professor.
It really started in 1862. John D. Rockefeller and a couple other individuals formed a small refining company in Cleveland, Ohio. The oil industry at that time was a very new industry, and it was an extremely competitive industry. And what Rockefeller noticed is that prices would skyrocket, and then there would be overproduction, and the bottom would fall out of the market. And as a result, started to think that there might be a way to gain more stability in the market if you could consolidate a number of companies so that they could coordinate their decisions.
If companies coordinate their decisions, can they control the market?
He and his associates began buying up a number of refineries, and by probably about 1882, the Standard Oil Company was in control of about 80 to 90% of the refining capacity in the United States. Standard grew huge, primarily by merger. The choice method was to buy people out who were in trouble, and representatives of Standard Oil would approach competing refiners with offers to buy. Sometimes the refiners were happy to sell. If they weren't happy to sell, then Standard would sometimes use other tactics. They were certainly very much in favor of any kind
I see you guys early in the morning, right?
Peace.
Till
They
next
also
time.
would use price cutting. Rockefeller used to refer